Welcome to a presentation concerned with troubleshooting in the analysis of the clause as a move, that is, in the interpersonal analysis of the clause. This will involve systems centrally like mood type, but also related systems like mood tagging, like subject person, like modality, modal assessment. In this first segment, I will touch primarily on general principles and on mood type. And I invite you to suggest other areas where you would like help with troubleshooting. One area of problems or troubles is polysemy. And we talked about this several weeks ago, the polysemy of modal auxiliaries and modal operators. So for example, if you have the modal operator can or cannot, then it could be interpreted, analyzed in terms of different mood types, including obligation versus readiness, potentiality or ability. And we saw that that was illustrated by Obama in the interview with Jimmy Kimmel. And at one point, Obama says, "I cannot drive." And then he realizes that that's ambiguous. What's the ambiguity? Well, we can resolve this by examining the system of modality type. And Obama himself, as he was monitoring what he said, realized that, to put in our terms, "I cannot drive" could be interpreted as a modulation of either obligation or readiness, ability. And the way to probe this then is to look at agnate or related versions of this. "I cannot drive," that's implicitly subjective in terms of orientation and the manifestation of the orientation. But if we look for an objective orientation and make it explicit, it might be, for example, "I'm not allowed to drive," or "I'm not able to drive." And in this case, what Obama meant was, I'm not allowed to drive, because he is able to drive. Now in dialogue, this is often sorted out, because dialogue interactants, they monitor each other and they may resolve the issues of this kind. And also in context, potential ambiguities often turn out not to be actual ambiguities, because you have enough information in the context and in the cotext to make the right analytical choice as a listener, as a reader, or as an analyst. Now I'd like to remind you that you have a troubleshooting section for the interpersonal area, chapter 3 of our textbook, Deploying Functional Grammar. And there are 4 subsections to troubleshooting, which covers just around 8 pages, so easy to go through. Your units of analysis in 3.1, identifying structural elements in 3.2, and ambiguous mood type or examples that could be analyzed potentially, possibly, in terms of one mood type or another in 3.3, and finally in 3.4, ambiguous polarity. I will focus here on 3.3. We'll come back to modality type in another segment. So 3.3 is concerned with mood type, and the task in troubleshooting is to resolve ambiguities. Let me take 3 examples, 2 of which are genuinely ambiguous, one of which could be mistaken for a mood type of a kind that is not. But let's read this from left to right according to the column headings. And you can check this against the troubleshooting section 3.3 in your textbook. So if you come across the example, you find a resemblance. And never mind the intonation, because that will give it away. Never mind the punctuation, because that may also give it away. You find a resemblance. As it stands, It could be analysed. It could be either a declarative clause or an imperative clause. And the task in analysis is to sort out which one, if you can resolve the ambiguity. And you can test this by checking different systems that are available to declarative clauses versus imperative clauses, or both. Let's start with the tag, the system mood tagging. It's available in both declaratives and imperatives, but the tags are different. If the clause is to be analysed as declarative, it would be, you find a resemblance, don't you? You find a resemblance, don't you? Or you found a resemblance, didn't you? Or you will find a resemblance, won't you? In contrast with the imperative, the finite of the mood tag, when the subject is you, the addressee, is always won't or will you. So you find a resemblance, won't you? So that's one way of sorting out the difference, which is intended. In a declarative, if we now look at the possibility of presuming the subject, so an implicit subject, it's not possible if the addressee is the subject. Went to the movies yesterday. That would be implicit subject, but it would the subject person presumed is I. I went to the movies, not the addressee. In contrast, in imperatives, subject presumption, typically in an addressee-oriented imperative, the subject is in fact implicit. So find a resemblance. In other words, related to you find a resemblance is find a resemblance. You find a resemblance, won't you? Find a resemblance, won't you? We can also note in terms of the system of polarity, which is open to both declaratives and imperatives, that's the relevant point. They're different in form. So if you find a resemblance is negative as a declarative, the form would be you don't find a resemblance with the tag, do you? But moving down to imperative, don't find a resemblance, will you? Don't you find a resemblance, will you? Don't you versus you don't. So you don't, do you? That's a declarative, but don't you, will you? That's an imperative. So in other words, as in declaratives in general, the negative version, the finite comes after the subject. You don't, you do. But in a negative imperative, the finite comes before the explicit subject. Don't you find it? Or if the subject is presumed, if it's implicit, don't find a resemblance. In declaratives, as in interrogatives, so in indicative clauses in general, the system of diacticity is available. We've looked at this in some detail. And you have a choice between temporal and modal. So in other words, if the clause is declarative, there should be a version with a modal. As in, you can find a resemblance, can't you? But that's not possible in imperative. So it's not possible to say, can find a resemblance, won't you? Why? Well, because imperatives haven't got access to the system of diacticity, temporal versus modal. You could say in a way that in imperative clauses, the value is fixed as modal and moreover fixed as modulation. But the meaning of find a resemblance, you find a resemblance, if imperative, is to do with obligation. And so the mood tag checks for readiness to perform whatever the addressee is obliged to do. In declaratives, you could have other subject persons. So you find a resemblance, don't you? Contrast with, for example, he finds a resemblance, doesn't he? Now move on to the second column. You find a resemblance. Okay, so on rising tone, you find a resemblance. Here there isn't actually an ambiguity. But the point is just to bring out the fact that this is a declarative clause, even though it has rising intonation. So the key of this declarative is either protesting or querying as a statement. You find a resemblance, so it's close to a tag version. You find a resemblance, don't you? Or you find a resemblance, do you? And in fact, it could be tagged. You find a resemblance, don't you? But the interrogative versions of this would be, do you find a resemblance? The usual realization of the yes-no interrogative, finite plus subject. Do you find a resemblance? And that can't be tagged. Do you find a resemblance, do you? Unless you speak of Australian English, where it's possible. So in other words, in this case, there is no ambiguity. It's not a yes-no interrogative. It's just a faux ami, something that looks as if it might be a yes-no interrogative, but isn't. And there is a significant difference in meaning between you find a resemblance and do you find a resemblance. So for example, in medical consultations, you might find the declarative with a rising tone alternating with tag declaratives when doctors are taking notes and sort of checking the medical history of patients, and they have an assumption that they're allergic or they've had some previous surgery or whatever, and then it's checking with the patient. Now, let's move on to the third column. And here you have a real ambiguity with this particular wording. So let me read it down somewhat robotically, because the intonation pattern actually resolves the ambiguity. Don't you ever go out? Okay. So it could be either yes-no interrogative or imperative. If you use yes-no interrogative, the key would be rising. Don't you ever go out? Tag wouldn't be, whereas in an imperative, it would be level. Don't you ever go out? With a yes-no interrogative, no tag is possible. Don't you ever go out, do you? Not possible. Unless, as we've seen, you're a speaker of Australian English. But in the imperative analysis, it is. Don't you ever go out, will you? And you can check that with what follows, right? So we can also look at the moves in exchanges and the uptake, as it were, the response. So don't you ever go out? No, I don't. Don't you ever go out? I won't. And in terms of subject presumption, in the yes-no interrogative, the subject itself can't just be left implicit. Don't ever go out? Not possible. But don't ever go out, will you? With an implicit addressee subject. Is possible if it's imperative. So in this way, you can resolve the ambiguity. As you shoot the troubles, you can resolve the ambiguity or bring out the alternative analyses by probing the clause and checking different versions, different variants, different agnate related variants, relying on systems that indicate choices among variants. Let me represent this for the first example. You find a resemblance. As we've seen, they could be either imperative. You find a resemblance, won't you? Or declarative. You find a resemblance, don't you? And we can systematically access systems available to one or the other mood type, or both, and check what they tell us when we look at variants of the clause we're trying to analyze. You find a resemblance. So in mood tagging, you find a resemblance, won't you? You find a resemblance, won't you? That would be imperative. But if declarative, the tag would be, don't you? You find a resemblance, don't you? Let me check with you. Yes, I do. No, I don't. You find a resemblance, won't you? Okay, I will. No, I won't. I refuse to. So that's checking it in terms of the options in tagged versions. And that's then relying on the fact that both declarative and imperative clauses in English in general can be tagged. And the tag is, as it were, a mirror image, a mirror of the mood selection. Another system we can examine is subject presumption. It's not shown in the network here, system network, but it's relevant to both imperative and declarative clauses. In imperative clauses, the presumed subject, if it's implicit, would be the addressee, you. Find a resemblance, won't you? But in a declarative clause, that's not possible with an addressee subject. Find a resemblance, don't you? Because the implicit subject in declarative would be the speaker, I, because declaratives realize statements, and what we do in life is keep talking about ourselves, making statements about ourselves. Another system is not visible here, but relevant, is a negative, as we've already seen. So the negative of you find a resemblance as an imperative would be, don't you find a resemblance, will you? Don't you find a resemblance? But the declarative negative would be, you don't find a resemblance, do you? So the negative of the imperative has, as we would expect, the finite first, don't, followed by the subject. The tone is, the intonation is more or less level. Don't you find a resemblance? Contrasting with the yes-no interrogative. Don't you find a resemblance? But in a declarative, you have subject before finite, so you don't find a resemblance, do you? In this way, then, we can use the description of the resources of the interpersonal clause grammar to probe any example we try to analyze. Separately, I'll give you a summary of the interpersonal clause grammar, but this is just to indicate that you can use what you've learned from the description of the interpersonal clause grammar resources available to interactants to probe examples in analysis. So you look around the examples and you look at variant examples, as well as checking what they mean and checking how they expressed, how they're realized, what the patterns are, like you don't versus don't you, for example, in terms of the sequence of subject and finite. So, for example, the system of diaticity, temporal versus modal, that's available to indicative clauses, so both declarative and interrogative clauses, but not to imperative clauses, because the finite in the imperative, if it's present, is always fixed in value. No contrast between temporal and modal. And as I said before, if anything, the sense of the finiteness of the imperative is that of imposed obligation. So in the mood tag, it's check of readiness to comply with the obligation. Now, I want to come back to the system of modality, because we've seen from Cahoots it's a bit challenging, but that will be in another segment of troubleshooting. Now, some general pointers in troubleshooting as you try to resolve ambiguities in the analysis. You should do the analysis based on the properties of interpersonal systems, terms and functions described in the textbook, and supporting material. So you can check Jeff Thompson's Introducing Functional Grammar, and if you brave Halliday and Matheson 2014, Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar. But don't base the analysis on some kind of folk understanding of labels, like exclamative. Check what exclamative actually signifies or represents in the description. And if you do, you'll find that exclamative is one type of declarative, a statement with an oomph, as I put it before. So that's important. Don't just take the label as face values as they're used in everyday discourse. You have to realize that they're technical terms and part of the descriptions that you have met. When you consider terms and system, consider the systemic neighborhood as I've already illustrated. View it from roundabout in terms of mood tagging, in terms of subject person, diacriticity, polarity, and so on. So, for example, if you think a clause is a yes-no interrogative, then you should be able to contrast it with a declarative. Is it raining? Versus it is raining, isn't it? So always look for the alternative versions, and that will reveal the possibilities of the analysis of the example. And more generally, adopt a trinocular view of the example you're analyzing. That means you can look at it from below, generalization. For example, a sort of realization, subject before finite versus finite before subject. Okay? Finite before, no, it shouldn't be finite before finite. Yes, sorry, no, that's great. So, subject before finite, it is, as in, is it raining? Finite before subject, is it, as in, is it raining? And you can also look from below in terms of tone. If you're looking at a or listening to a spoken example, it's raining. Is it raining? It's raining, falling tone. Is it raining? Rising tone. You can look at it from above. What does it mean? So, for example, statement, it's raining, versus question, is it raining? In other words, if you're looking at mood type, you can try to determine what's the speech function. And one way of determining the speech function is to look what's happening in the dialogue around it. What's the uptake, say, in a response, or if it is a response, what is it a response to? So always look at it contextually, as it were, in its environment. And you could do that if you examine the meaning. So statement followed by, or say question followed by statement, or command followed by compliance, or offer followed by acceptance, and so on. From roundabout, in terms of the system itself, agnate or closely related version, what I call the systemic neighborhood. And I've illustrated this already in reference to tagging, subject person, diacriticity, polarity, and so on. So in other words, what you're doing is you're probing paradigms as part of the analysis. Probing paradigms. For example, from roundabout, you're checking related agnate clauses. So for example, if you come across just relax, as you did in the Kahoot, based on Cat Stevens or Yusuf's father and son, you can term it as an imperative clause by checking the nature of the mood tag. Just relax, won't you? With won't you being the mood tag of an addressee-oriented imperative. Check a version with an explicit subject. Just relax. You just relax, won't you? Checking a version with an explicit finite. Just relax. Do just relax, as opposed to negative, don't just relax. So that's what we understand by paradigm probing. You look at closely related or agnate versions of the clause, and suddenly the grammar will reveal what kind of clause you're dealing with. And you can do it from above by checking what speech functions it realizes. So if you think, if you analyze just relax, you can hypothesize that, well, it looks like an imperative, in which case it's a command. And so in interaction, it will be treated like a command. Just relax. Okay, I will. No, I won't. I refuse to. Why should I? And you can check how it can be realized by another mood type that may realize, say, a polite command. Will you just relax? Okay, I will. No, I won't. You should relax. Okay, I will. No, I won't. Now, you had some problems with exclamative in Kahoots. And again, reminder, don't read off, don't understand terms just in folk terminology. You have to understand them as technical terms in the technical description of the grammar, in this case, interpersonal clause grammar. And if you read your textbook, you will find that exclamative is a type of declarative. Exclamative is a special and not very common type of declarative clause. As I put it before, it's a statement, and statements are realized by declaratives, but a statement with a special oomph, okay, a special punch. Declarative clauses are typically non-exclamative, but there is also an exclamative option. And if you look at table 3.3 of the textbook, you can see this, right? Indicative, declarative, in the left-hand side column. Non-exclamative, subject before finite, they will build a house. And exclamative, how quickly they will build a house. Like the declarative clauses in general, the exclamative declaratives are realized by sequence of subject before finite. You are clever, you are. How clever you are, you are. But the subject preceded by a WH element, either how or what, as in WH interrogatives. But it is not a demand for information. It's not an interrogation, it's an exclamation. It's a special oomph. So unlike declarative WH interrogatives, the WH element is not followed immediately by the finite. So contrast declarative, exclamative, how quickly they built the house, with interrogative, WH, how quickly have they built the house? So again, how quickly they built the house versus how quickly have they built the house? And notice, incidentally, that in the WH interrogative, the WH element is always followed by the finite. So a typical mistake, depending on L2 speakers of English, even if they're advanced, depending on the language they come from, is instead of how quickly have they built the house, how quickly they built the house. In other words, to overlook the principle that the WH is followed by the finite. And if you'd like more information about exclamatives, you can examine this section from Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar. I provided the section here so you can review it. Important point then is these clauses have a WH element, what or how, in a nominal group or a adverbial group. Okay. What a self-opinionated egomaniac that guy is. Who is it? Bob Hawke. Or what a darling you are. Or what a disagreeable old man I've become. Or how secretive you are. So notice again the sequence subject before finite. So subject before finite in declarative, as in declaratives in general, contrasting with WH interrogatives, where the sequence is WH followed by finite. So in this example, right, what a disagreeable old man I've become. That's just an example. It's not about a statement about myself, okay? I have, okay, subject finite. Another thing you could check is this in respect to polarity. So unlike declaratives that are non-exclamative, where you have a free choice between positive and negative, exclamatives can only be positive. So it's perfectly fine to say how clever you are, but it's very odd or impossible to say how clever you're not, or how clever you aren't. So exclamatives, as it were, conditionally have to be positive. If exclamative, then positive, which is what this arrow indicates. Whereas for non-exclamatives, as I said before, you have a free choice. You're very clever, you're not very clever. Okay, this was troubleshooting segment 1 for the interpersonal clause grammar. Next, tell me what you would like, won't you? For example, modality type. All right. Thank you for attending.